My name is Sofia Ehrich, and I'm an art historian, researcher, and consultant for multisensory experiences. My company, the Olfactory Contractor, coaches and consults museum practitioners and others on the educational impact smell can have on the public. It is my pleasure to welcome you as the host of the Internet of Senses Institute podcast for the Sense of Smell. And today I have Nezka Pfeifer with me, who is an interdisciplinary museum curator who develops botanically themed exhibitions at the Stephen and Peter Sachs Museum at the Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis, a world-renowned research and horticultural organization. She focuses on the projects where botany, culture, and art are intertwined through exhibition narratives and multicultural experiences. So welcome, Nezka.
Thank you so much, Sophia. So glad to be here.
So can you start by introducing yourself? I know I gave the bio, but it's nice to be able to introduce yourself and explain what your role is as a curator at a museum in a botanical garden.
Thank you. I will. So my background has always been working in museums, specifically developing exhibitions and working with collections. So my training is included an undergrad degree in history as well as a master's degree in museum studies. But over the course of my career, as I've worked for a lot of different museums, I've had the opportunity to work with museums that had science collections or taxidermy collections, including and as well as a small herbarium collection. And so it ended up being kind of a perfect fit to join the Missouri Botanical Garden about 7.5 years ago when they were restarting their museum as an open exhibition space. And so my role, basically, the mandate is to share the stories of the garden with botanists and botanical research, but I also see it going a bit further in terms of developing narratives that explore like the overlooked ways that plants impact our lives. So that way I'm tying in the garden research, but to much larger, like global subjects, human subjects, and themes that are relevant to like what are our current social interests and culture. And so the main difference I have in this job compared to previous ones is that I don't actually manage any collections at all. So I'm working with all the different departments around the garden that have collections, live collections, scientific collections, as well as objects and artifacts and books as well. But in this way, it's I'm able to work with a greater number of people in terms of this, but it's also they bring their expertise on the different materials as well as all of the different research threads that are happening throughout the garden.
It seems natural to me that a museum in a botanical garden would be multisensory and that it would fit. Is it always the case that a botanical garden has a museum, or did the Missouri Botanical Garden always have a museum? Because you said that they were just restarting it when you came in.
That's right. Yes. So the garden, it's not the oldest, but it's one of the oldest botanical gardens in the United States. It was started in 1859, and the museum was started at around that time as well. The garden's founder, Henry Shaw, was very much interested in emulating a lot of what he saw at Kew Gardens in London, or the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. And they happened to have 4 museums of economic botany. That's what they used to call it, ethnobotany. And so he was very enamored with one of these buildings. And so he had his local St. Louis architect, who also happened to be English, just like he was, create and design this building that would be kind of the scientific heart and focus of the garden amidst all of the gardens that were being designed and grown and tended by the horticulturists. And so for most of the 19th century, that's what this building, the museum, served. It was displays of botanical parts and objects, but then also held the collections of the herbarium, which are these vouchered specimens that have been collected and then pressed and attached to archival pieces of paper. And, you know, our collection has grown since that time frame. So, you know, it might have started out with a few thousand specimens in 1859. And so that was manageable in the building that is the museum. But today it is over 8 million and growing. So clearly we're not stuffing all of those into this historic building. So the botanical garden has developed and built other structures in which these collections are now held. And so these, as a result, sort of the emphasis on the museum sort of became less. And particularly in the 20th century, it stopped having that function. It was no longer a museum, at least not to the records that we have that we can tell. The archival materials are a little bit sparse on the museum. It did become a restaurant at one point. So one of the galleries was converted into a kitchen, and the museum is renowned for this really beautiful mural, botanical mural. And that was sort of the site where all of the diners could sit. It also held offices and classes and some research space. So it was still a used building, but I would say probably the last 30 years, from the 90s onwards, it wasn't really accessible by the public or used for any programming whatsoever. So it was with the arrival of the most recent president, Peter West Jackson, who was very interested in ethnobotany and collections and museums, that the museum was in fact then put on the docket to be renovated and restored and sort of brought back to its previous glory as an exhibition space. And so a few modifications took place, including adding heating and cooling because it didn't have that. The mural, in fact, unfortunately could not be saved. So it was documented and then reinterpreted on canvas. So it was no longer on plaster. And then also an annex was built attached to this building to enable for much better physical accessibility. So a stairwell, an elevator allowed for being able to move between the two floors of the building. So in this way, it's sort of given new life to the opportunity that the garden has a space to tell the science stories, but also tie in a lot of other interesting narratives that we have that are historical as well as cultural, and potentially also relate to St. Louis and other global parts of the world that we work in.
And the space has evolved so much over time, and also saying like it's been a research hub, but also a restaurant. You also have this like multi-sensory element there to the space. So that's very cool. So what excites you about the sense of smell?
I have always been interested in my sense of smell. I probably didn't pay attention to it as much, but in terms of what I think is possible is, to me, like smell or scent is really just another form of intelligence and knowledge that gives us unique information and understanding of the time and the space that we're inhabiting in that moment. And it's so ephemeral and fleeting. And I think like those are the kinds of things that interest me the most sometimes when it comes to interpreting subjects for the public. It's what are we trying to capture, not necessarily fixating on things that have been long standing, but things that are unique and different for each person as they experience them. And I think scent embodies that perfectly.
Yeah, definitely. So something that I haven't mentioned yet is that you have your current exhibition that you curated is an olfactory exhibition. So before I ask you why it's important to use scent in the museum, I want you to introduce your exhibition briefly and tell us about it.
Of course. So the exhibition is called Smelling the Bouquet, Plants and Scents in the Garden. And it opened in May, early May of 2025, and will be on view till the end of March of 2026. And the main goal for me was that I took very seriously the fact that the museum is in the garden. And so I wanted to feature a spectrum of plant smells that focus both on the scents that people have known and sort of exploited, like, for example, perfumery and incense, but also on these really interesting, unique plants we have in our live collections here at the garden that a lot of people may not have had experience with and most certainly wouldn't have been able to smell. So these were goals, and we ended up being able to offer almost 3 dozen smells in the exhibition, which I'm not going to lie, I was pretty thrilled with that we were able to achieve that many.
Yeah, that's a lot of sense. That's great. So this could be from your perspective before you curated the exhibition and after, but why do you think it's important to use olfactory storytelling or scent in the museum space?
Like we feed our visual sense very often, and sometimes we feed our auditory sense. But I think because, harkening back to what I said earlier, to me it presents another opportunity to interpret and understand something. And we all are, I mean, for those of us who have our senses of smell, because I've become much more knowledgeable of the fact that people do not have, not everyone has a strong sense of smell. It is such a way to place yourself and understand what's going on. Is this a place where I am going to be stressed? Is this a place where I'm going to be relaxed? Am I curious? Am I not familiar with what I'm smelling? Am I going to figure this out? And I think one of the things that our garden, I mean, the Missouri Botanical Garden has so many excellent horticultural experts, and they do so many interesting different things. And I particularly am so impressed with our designers and the people who plan out all of the gardens that we have, and particularly the gardens that are around the museum. And they are extremely sensory focused. So we try not to encourage too often the opportunity for the public to touch because we don't want them to damage plants. But we actually do have a garden that's purely a sensory garden where people are, in fact, allowed to touch everything. So the idea that plants are a sensory experience, particularly for these hort experts, but it's also like when you're growing your own plants or you're gardening, you have that access as well. So it becomes an entirely sensory experience. And I know just for me personally, I am always such a scent focused experiencer when it comes to plants. Like I want to smell a plant, I want to smell the bloom, I want to smell anything else, the leaves, because to me that's that's one of the exciting ways I can know a plant. So when I am not able to smell anything, or it's just green or smells like dirt, I'm always a little bit disappointed. So this was a way to sort of get people in thinking about plants and also thinking about them, as a full organism, but also about the idea of, well, if it has a smell and maybe it's not about whether or not the plant has a smell that you like, but whether or not you are just experiencing the complexity of what that smell is. And I think also through the course of this exhibition and doing the research, and particularly listening to the scientists, we assume so much that the plants create these smells for us, but they don't. They're creating them for their pollinators. The scent is a way for them to communicate. And so we are just so, anthropocentric that we think the cells are just about us, but they're not. And so getting people to think that way too, that, it's great if you like the smell, but if you don't, that's okay, because it's not for you. It's for the creature, whatever that is, it's going to come and help this plant survive into the future.
Yeah, and to me, it's such a natural fit, scent and plants, because it's not every plant smells, of course. And some emit VOCs that don't smell, that don't have a smell, at least not to us or not to many or just to animals. But it's such a communication mechanism for plants. So it's also interesting to have an exhibition that highlights not only, okay, yeah, it smells, but why, and educates through that. So it's very special, I think. And I don't know, I would love to know how many botanical gardens have had olfactory exhibitions. I'm sure there have been some.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's funny because, and I didn't say this earlier, but like it is actually kind of rare for a garden to have a museum. Early on in the days of botanical gardens, they often did, but many of them have closed. Just like this one, the one here at Mobot closed. Maybe now a lot of them will have art galleries, but they're not experiential spaces in quite the same way that a museum is. Like they're there for you to see artwork that's interpreting some element of plants, but not necessarily something in which you are meant to engage. Or they have like, a discovery center or something like that that's not necessarily got collections in it in interpreting science in a more complex way. So I think this is just a really great opportunity to lean into so many threads of the plants and the people that are working with them. And also like scent research in general is growing slow. Like at the time I was working on the exhibition a couple of years ago, we had 2 scientists who had actually had experience with headspace or scent trapping. And now more of our scientists have had experience with it because of the exhibition project. And they understand that this is something that's a growing avenue to pursue. And that, at some point, hopefully the garden will do more in terms of investing in equipment and so forth to get this to continually become a subject that people are paying attention to, just in the plants that we're studying.
So since you mentioned headspace, you've mentioned a few words like horticulturalist. So what kind of interdisciplinary research has been done that has gone into your exhibition or has gone specifically into the scent aspects of your exhibition?
Yes. So the first thing was really like identifying the plants that we wanted to feature. That took a little bit of time, but also understanding why scent was important to the scientists. So we have the botany, the shape of the plant, why it's making the smell that it's making, and understanding that relationship with pollinators and insects. So I had scientists helping me with that who were expert from UC Davis who are studying plant chemical interactions. So that was one element. And then there was just the understanding of what volatile organic compounds are, right? So VOCs, and how each one is different. And what's so interesting about some of the scent trapping or headspace trapping that's happened by botanists in the field in rainforests, for example, while they're studying their species of specific families of plants. They have, in fact, identified brand new compounds that nobody had named before. So these were volatiles that existed and the plant was giving off, but they never needed to be harnessed by humans for some sort of economic purpose, like perfume or something else. So there's probably so many. There's probably, gosh, no, who knows, thousands at the very least of volatile compounds that we don't even understand yet because these plants haven't been studied in this way. So these are the kinds of things that I think will hopefully push forward even in the garden's own research. But then there was also the aspect of art and design and including beautifully designed perfume bottles from a private collection, the Dree House collection that's in Chicago, that has a really fantastic collection that they love lending to museums because the collector, who has now passed away, he was an avid connoisseur and collector of Art Nouveau and Art Deco and even arts and crafts, objects that range from tiny little bits like jewelry and perfume bottles until much, much larger pieces. And so these things are ways to sort of materialize scent, right? Because this is some of the ways that we get to experience scent when we're interested in perfume. We have these beautiful bottles, and they're something that also help not just sell the fragrance, but also embody the fragrance visually for us, because tying visual and other senses along with smelling, I think, is also something that kind of ties people, whether it's the smell of onions cooking and that there's going to be a meal and then you're going to have potentially family or close people or loved ones around you while you're having this. I mean, I think there's a lot of materiality to how people experience scent and what they connect with it. And so these were also the kinds of connections I was hoping to make that would touch people in different ways, like creatively and in their memory, to hopefully spark conversations in the galleries themselves. So you've got things that are, looking at very much at sort of the basic elements of a plant together with all the different cultures and how they use them, particularly, for example, say incense, burning plant resin for different religious or spiritual purposes. And so all of the things that kind of go into that, and growing the plants and growing them particularly in perfumery, in a scale that can be in which millions and millions of people are going to be able to experience these things, because so many millions of flowers need to be used to make a jasmine absolute, right? And then it has to get refined, and it's an international industry. The plants are being grown in places like India or Egypt, and then they get sent to France and they get refined there, and then they get turned into perfume, and then they go back around the world. So that sort of level of history and economics, I think, was also kind of important to include whenever possible.
Yeah, your exhibition is so vast, I think. And I mean, it's something we haven't mentioned is that Nezka and I have actually known each other since she started the process of researching this exhibition. I guess maybe you already had done some research before you contacted me, but it's also really amazing to see how your process has gone and how you've evolved as like a scent person, I would now call you, even though you're a curator. So because there's so many museum practitioners out there or heritage professionals that may be weary of using scent in the museum, I would love if you talked about your process of curating the exhibition, how it went for you, maybe how you started, and some of the maybe challenges you faced. I think that would be really interesting for those who have never curated an olfactory exhibition before, or who are thinking of doing so.
Oh yeah, and I know I would say that I had done sort of a lot of historical reading, particularly about perfume, but I knew that I needed to get a bit beyond perfume. But when we met, over 3 years ago now, right? It's probably closer to 3.5. I was really at that crux of, okay, we have several problems to solve or challenges to solve. And it was like, what can this exhibition do that's not been done yet, right? A lot of art museums have done scent exhibitions, and more came along as I was working on this one. But it was also, how are we going to get the scent to be smellable or sniffable? And also, making sure that I was working with perfumers, because if it weren't for the two perfumers who happen, thankfully to be local here to St. Louis, Sean Marr of Marr Olfactive and Weston Adam of Phronema Perfumes, both of them, I met Sean first and actually had quite a few conversations with him about sort of the technology of what we wanted to do and kind of the scope. And we really sort of left it open for a very long time. We had lots of conversations. And I would say probably in the last year and a half before the show opened is when we were really narrowing down of like what the scents were. And at this point, Weston had also joined us in terms of working out the challenges. And it was really like over a year ago, year and a half ago, we started doing these sort of sniffing meetings. And we were like, okay, we really need to narrow down what are the things. But the question of how we were going to deliver the scent was probably one of the biggest challenges. And that was with me for quite some time. And we originally thought we would potentially have some sort of liquids, depending on how the scent was held. And then we would have blotters because I had seen that done in some exhibitions. But we were concerned about waste. We were concerned about sustainability. We were also concerned about just mess, to be honest. And, when you have potentially thousands of people coming to see an exhibition, the garden gets over 1 million visitors a year. And I definitely get fewer people than that in through the museum, but that still potentially could be anywhere from 35 to 50,000 people coming to interact with the content. And so we knew we needed to make it pretty durable, maybe not particularly high tech, because that would be probably more difficult to maintain both capacity wise and budget wise. And so when we narrowed down through the process of elimination to have several tables throughout the exhibition in which these tiny little knobbed glass cloches would be sitting, and the scent would be applied inside the glass cloche without any additional paper, because the scent would pretty much be able to adhere to the surface of the glass. And that would be continually refreshed over the course of the exhibition pretty regularly. We figured that was going to be the safest, the sort of cleanest in terms of aesthetics, but also the most easily replaced should something happen, like they were dropped. And most importantly, and I know you and I have talked about this a number of times, where the public really feels like they need to control when they have access to a scent. A lot of people have sensitivities to scent. Sometimes when you have alcohol-based scents, they often do sort of burn your nose a little bit more. And so you sort of develop an olfactory fatigue, and it's harder for you to smell them. And maybe you get a headache or something like that. So we knew we needed to create something that was a little bit more controllable. And so with these cloches, the way that I worked with an artisan carpenter who was able to build these beautiful tables, but also create what we called these cloche boards, where they were sort of like these inset pieces of wood that were treated as well and routed out so that we could put the cloches really nicely in a very organized way. And then each of these cloche spaces could be labeled so you knew what you were smelling. That turned out to be the most kind of mechanically reasonable and also attractive way to install this. And so we have lost some cloches, not gonna lie. We definitely lost a few, definitely not as many as expected. So probably maybe a handful and a half at this point, but that's like 4 months later, so that's not bad, I think. And one of the final things that we sort of leaned into was the exhibition is for people who probably don't have a lot of exposure to scent, but we also wanted people who are scent nerds or frag heads or whatever they call themselves who are interested in scent. And there is a culture within perfume shops and candle shops and other sort of more scent forward merchandise type stores where you have a glass cloche covering whatever it is that you're smelling. So you have to sniff inside that. So a lot of those folks who are already quite experienced with that don't even need to be told how to do the sniffing in the exhibitions, which is quite nice. So all of that were like, once we sort of settled that and developed that, it was just a question of getting all the design elements right. And lastly, I also wanted to find an olfactory artist who was going to embody, because obviously the perfumers are olfactory experts, but they are specifically making perfumes that are products for the market, and that's how they interpret that. Someone like Gail Knowles, who I ended up working with, she's much less interested in creating a perfume, but she's interested in creating an scent that people can experience. And so often you're not wearing it, although you potentially can. She created something several years ago that was called the World Sensorium, in which almost 200 countries around the world were surveyed, and they were asked what their number one important olfactory aromatic plant was culturally. And so when she compiled all the responses, she then created the scent in which she calculated the essential oil of that plant in proportion to the population of that country. So for like a little island nation, it's very tiny, but for a country like China or India, where they have a billion plus people, it's obviously going to be a bigger percentage. And then those plants then were all kind of merged together into this global scent. And so almost a quarter of the countries involved actually are very jasmine forward. So for me, it's a very jasmine forward smell. But it was interesting because it was a lot of olfactory artists are not necessarily interested in looking at plants specifically. They clearly use plant compounds and so forth, but that's not the story that they're telling with the scent. But Gail definitely is. And she's also highlighting challenges of environmental change and climate change and deforestation, and what will be the access to these plants and these essential oils, for example, in the future. And so these are all messages and that also reflect what we do as the garden and, you know, the work that we do around the world concerned about conservation and replanting in areas that have been devastated or deforested. And these are long-term projects, and identifying, you know, endangered plants that potentially are useful or have been useful, but they've been over-harvested or just disappearing because of these other environmental things. So making sure that all of these discipline elements also sort of intersected in the storytelling was also really important. And so that to me also is part of the vastness of the story. You know, we're looking at a lot of wonderful plants that people enjoy all the time in their gardens or in perfume, but we're also trying to tell the story of, you know, can you imagine going through life and not being able to smell jasmine again? Or what about this fantastic plant from Madagascar that we happen to have growing in our climatron, which is the world's first geodesic dome tropical greenhouse that was built here in St. Louis in 1960. And it's this fabulous plant called an Ixora masoalensis. It grows in this one tiny little spot in Madagascar. We've happened to be able to grow it. We have a couple plants of it in our climatron, and it has got such a fantastic scent. It's really this like creamy indolic sweet smell. And Sean was interested in interpreting it. So he interpreted, but clearly that plant can't be turned into a perfume. It's an endangered plant. You know, there are few individuals around. So what if that interesting plant that adds to this olfactory landscape in Madagascar no longer exists? And so these are the kinds of questions that I'm hoping people will pay attention to. And also one of the goals of the exhibition to get people thinking about truly the spectrum of smells. It's not just about these rich floral roses or jasmines. It's all these other plants and all of these different notes that they have that are complex and interesting and, you know, meant for other creatures besides ourselves.
From the beginning, you talked about your perfumers that you found. So I wanted to back you up a little bit, because what was so amazing about watching your process of creating this exhibition was also how much you like embedded yourself into the networks of scent culture, I guess you could call it, but like the overlappings of that. And so I think this is something that's very interesting to highlight for people, that you contacted me, I don't know, 3.5 years ago, but by the next time we had spoken, you had talked to so many other people and linked yourself in different networks in order to find what you needed to find for your exhibition, which is very special, I think. And so I wanted to highlight that because you found these local perfumers, which is really great. It's a really great way to highlight people who are within your local networks. And so I think that was really cool. But you also, you know, you talked to Andreas Keller at Olfactory Art Keller about what olfactory artworks to use. And so this is also a very interesting act that you had to do in order to succeed at your exhibition. So I wanted to highlight that. I don't know if you have comments about it, but it highlights how hard it is to curate an exhibition that is olfactory related. And we need to continue to talk about this because it's challenging for just anyone to curate an exhibition like this if they don't have access to the networks that they need to have access to. And I know you worked really hard to build yourself into that network.
Yes, and I appreciate you mentioning that because it probably was the most, particularly in the early years of what I was, because I was still trying to figure out what this was going to look like. Like now it seems like a done deal. Like, oh, how did I not know that this is how it was going to turn out? But, you know, obviously there were still a lot of questions, even when we first met, right? Like I was still exploring a lot of stuff. Part of it is scent was particularly before the pandemic, when I knew I was going to do this exhibition. And then, of course, things changed with the pandemic. I mean, not only how we were able to connect with things, but also how kind of important scent became as a topic, right? Because of people who unfortunately got COVID or lost their senses of smell, of which I knew many. It was scent just kept growing and growing. And I felt like what was happening was it wasn't just the field of professional perfumers, right? Which is a very sort of closed environment and kind of almost club like. And I was really starting to learn a lot more about what independent perfumery was. And as a result, I saw that there was just so much diversity. Like there were so many ways to go about this. And there wasn't just one way to understand and talk about perfume from like this high fashion sense way. And so as a result, like, I'll be honest, I'm a generalist curator, so I'm almost always needing to learn the subject I'm about to do an exhibition on. And so I'm often going to be doing a lot of that sort of self-directed, particularly reading and literature review and scholarship review. But in terms of a subject like this, for which there really wasn't a module or a lot of examples to follow, it meant having to talk to people. Because, and what was also so amazing is, like, you were clearly one of these people at the beginning. Everyone was so generous in sharing. Like, it was never like I got to talk to somebody, got on their calendar, and then they were like unwilling to answer questions. Like, they wanted to know what I was trying to do, and then they would offer, their expertise. Or if I had very specific questions, like, how do you do this, they would explain that, like, this is what you probably, the easiest thing is if you do this, but there's also all these other opportunities. So being able to have constant interaction and then discussion, it really enabled me to understand kind of where the problems lay for me in terms of the decisions I had to make. And so some decisions were very easy and some decisions were not. And some decisions took literal years to sort out. So I think that it was the constant conversation and the sharing and the generosity of spirit, particularly amongst this scent world that I'm very lucky. I mean, I'm honored to be considered a part of it because it's just been so engaging, and I've learned so much. And I think the other thing is also I've learned so much that I can't imagine giving this up. And that's not always what happens when I'm curating a show. Like often, oh, that was great. I had an amazing time. People are excellent. I can put that subject to bed now and go jump on to the next 3 I've got to work on. But this has been like one of the most sparking exhibitions, because not only did it get all sorts of interesting conversations going with my coworkers and colleagues here at the garden, but they're more interested to keep pursuing this. Like they definitely, the key scientist that worked with me is her name's Monica Carlson Krause. Like she's on the scent train. Like she is going to keep doing scent-based botanical research, and like that's amazing. I mean, I would love to see more and more of the garden scientists. But the horticulture experts are now also, they were always interested in scent because that's their experience with plants. But they understand that there's now a larger opportunity to teach more in terms of scent and plants, besides just, the sensory garden, for example. Like the manager of our gardening center, which is called the Kemper Center for Home Gardening, is Dana Kelly. And she, in fact, actually took both mine and the perfumer's suggestions on potential plants that could be added to that fragrance garden that they manage there. So, I mean, were able to get planted this year, including some gardenias, which is great. But there were other plants that the horticulturals there, Jim, was already planning, that are scent-based. One of the challenges is also any plant that we grow here on grounds, we don't buy the plant already growing. Like we have to get a seed and then we have to propagate it so that we know the environment that it has lived in its entire life, and we're not worried about bringing in pests or fungus or anything like that to the plant, to the garden. So sometimes it might take a few years before we'll see some of these examples, but I have a feeling that we've really sort of set a path towards continuing scent here. And so I'm looking forward to continually exploring it. Even if my subject of an exhibition is different and maybe not immediately scent focused, it will still have scent elements to it. And one of the other interesting things, so my supervisor, manager, boss is the director of the Ethnobotany Center here at the garden. His name's Robbie Hart. He is a scientist that focuses on climate change in mountain areas, specifically focused in the Himalayas, but he travels all over the world. And he contributed some elements, particularly about incense in Bhutan, into the exhibition. But he was really interested in our herbarium specimens and what kind of data we could get from this 8 million I was talking about earlier. And, they all have labels on them, and a lot of them have descriptions to them. And only about like 10% of them actually have descriptions of scent. But some key collectors that have contributed a lot of examples, a lot of specimens to their herbarium, would often mention scent. And so the goal is maybe at some point to create a protocol in which these specimens and this data could be converted to some system in which people are making sure to mention plant smell every single time they collect something, and create the label that will then go into the herbarium label and will then be there for perpetuity for people to read. Because once you get the plant on a specimen, it has mostly lost its aroma. So it's been pressed and dried and potentially shipped and handled by a great amount of people. And so it's I promise you, rose specimens no longer have any kind of rose smell in the herbarium tax.
Well, and the smell will evolve from when you put it in and from when, like, years later. But that's a really interesting thing that I'll mention, is that you're talking about something where, like, the digital archive or the written archive of a specimen will then include smell, which is so important and still not being done enough. So that's really cool. If that happens, that's really amazing.
I know it's something they're working on. So potentially I don't know if this will necessarily become a paper, but it'll be definitely something. I know that's the end goal, but I'm not quite sure when that will happen just yet. Hopefully soon, though.
Yeah, cool. Can you briefly say what your biggest challenge was in the whole process of curating this exhibition?
I've already explained the cloche challenge. I would say that was definitely a big one, but I think the other one was, there are thousands of scents. What do we put in the exhibition? Like crafting the sections and choosing the smells. I would say that was the other big challenge, because I think a lot of people came to this whenever they would ask me what I was working on, and I would tell them the show. A lot of people came with so many preconceived ideas about what I would be including in the exhibition, and they were immediately just assuming that I would only be doing perfumery. And I really needed that to not be the case. There are over 50 plants represented in the exhibition. Unfortunately, we couldn't have people smell them all. It just wasn't, even almost 3 dozen is a lot of smells, and for the most part, it doesn't seem like visitors are getting any kind of olfactory fatigue. But the spectrum of smells of what they're smelling, including both the fragrances that the perfumers interpreted and created, as well as the things that we know are compounds. They're just, some of them are strong and spicy, some of them are very piney, some of them are sweet and floral, and we even have quite a stinky plant as well. That was an important goal. So figuring out all of that was really the biggest challenge, because nothing, to my knowledge, an exhibition like this has not been done before, in which someone has really leaned into a source material as the teaching mechanism for scent. Obviously, we weren't going to be exploring any animal-based scents, like animal musks and so forth. So that sort of cut things out. No, I mean, thankfully, because that's a whole other complex story. But tying perfumery and incense and then all these amazing plants, that was a real challenge. That was really hard. And I even was squeezing a scent in like 2 months before the show opens.
So olfactory design, in terms of like how the visitors will smell the physical scent, which I completely understand, because there's also a lot of options for that, but you have to make it best for your visitors and also be able to build it and have, the scent be perceivable, all those things. So that makes a lot of sense. And then even though you had these amazing perfumers that you found, also choosing the scents and developing the scents were also slightly a challenge. But I guess that's a big challenge for you, because you're in a botanical garden. So you really had such a broad scope, whereas other museums might have lesser scope if they're working with the collection at hand. You really had to shape this from the ground up in terms of what you were using for your story that you were telling. So both are very understandable. So kind of a wrap up, but what has been the impact of this olfactory exhibition? I know you've had a lot of visitors, and has it been positive? Will you do it again? I think you already said you're going to definitely include scent again, but what's the impact of this? How have people been navigating the space also, like in terms of smells? Has anyone been complaining?
I would say the The minor complaints, they are quite minor, is so some of the smells are just very fleeting. So, and we weren't going to be putting preservatives in them. So some of the compounds like limonene and some of the, particularly the compounds that we have a section on pollinators that the UC Davis students, Marisa Sandoval and Jason Liu, shared with me. And those just don't have a very strong life. So they tend to have to get reapplied more regularly. But I would say that outside of that tiny complaint, the only feedback I've really heard is positive. It's people are just, oh, and this also is, so the team that staffs the museum and makes it open to the public, or the visitor services team. And so they give me a lot of anecdotal descriptions of how people are moving through the space, because I ask them, they get to witness it all the time. And people just are like hungry for all the smells. Like, it just seems as soon as people realize that this is how they are going to navigate through the show, they just sniff, 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 and they're talking. And, I don't know that people are necessarily reading labels, but, there are definitely some hardcore readers out there who will be spending time and reading labels. But I would say that overall, it's been really positive. The visitors have enjoyed it. The garden leadership has enjoyed it. The staff has enjoyed it. I've had more requests to give tours to other departments from around the garden to come and experience the show, which is also really nice.
And you've had a lot of visitors. Like, I mean, visitors, but also like visitor numbers. But I meant that you've had some people visit specifically to see the exhibition and smell the exhibition.
Yes, exactly. So in our first 2 months, we had 10,000 people come and see the exhibition. So like that broke a record by like 1,000, which was kind of amazing. We've had a very hot summer in St. Louis, so the numbers have sort of contracted a little bit, but we still have had probably 16, 17,000 people come and see the show by now, which is, for the end of August, is pretty amazing. And several lovely scent folks have come to see, from our big expanded group of scent people, have come to see the show as well. More will be coming this weekend, which is also really nice because, getting people, this is not going to be a traveling experience or a kit experience, right? So you really do have to come to the garden, to the museum to experience it and sniff everything. The perfumers were really generous, though. They were willing to make perfumes out of the 8 interpretive fragrances that they made of the plants. And so people can buy them. They can buy them directly and buy those perfumes, which is great, and experience that. I think for the people who have come in who have never been to the museum before, because every once in a while that'll happen, they're just amazed that this was a subject. And they're just so surprised at the breadth of what has been able to be put together and the fact that there are all of these scents. So overall, I can't imagine not including scent again. Yeah.
That's good to hear. Well, and you have all the knowledge now. I mean, you know how to present it. You've got some perfumers. You could definitely do it again. So.
Yes. And I've got plans for the next show to have a couple of scents from the perfumers. So I think, and this will be fun because it'll be less about capturing the smells that are here, but more about their interpretation. So sort of allowing them the more of a freedom to do some artistry with their own ideas about potentially a scent.
That's great. Well, we'll definitely be continuing to follow your scent projects. And but thank you for joining the podcast. I was very happy to dive into this topic with you. Of course, we've had many conversations, but it's nice to have like a specific conversation about this. So thank you.
Well, and thank you for all of your guidance and expertise out all this time, and also for working with me on one of the projects at the museum as well. So Sophia created this gorgeous fragrant mural guide exploring the fragrant plants in the mural, and the mural depicts a lot of plants that grow here at the garden as well. So like this was like a really seminal thing to be able to do, because I'd never had the opportunity to do before, and it was so excellent that scent was the avenue by which we could do this. So no, I can't wait to see next things from you as well. So
thanks. All right, thanks, Nezka.
Thanks, Sophia.